So I'm going to talk about the geologic considerations in, I'm going to say high volume water users because it's not just data centers that we're thinking about. There are going to be more high volume water users that are coming to the region if the industries that we're seeing in other areas are coming into this area. I'm a research and policy director at Freshwater. We're a 50-some-year-old water nonprofit, and I'm a geologist by training, professional geologist with a PhD in the field. Freshwater works in three different areas of water research. We try to translate that research into policy. We also try to translate that research into engagement, empowerment, education opportunities, and most importantly, we try to connect these three things. We try to communicate between the sectors that are typically separated or siloed. We try to coordinate among the players and collaborate so that people in the regions can drive the kind of action they need to preserve water. The problem we see with this current trend in data center development is typical of any kind of capitalist endeavor is that the speed of business often exceeds the speed of policy. And we know that Minnesota and the Great Lakes region are targets for water-intensive industries as climate changes, as the coasts deplete their water resources or have saltwater intrusion. We're seeing businesses assume water is available in the Great Lakes region. So the other water-intensive industries that we're seeing knocking on our doors are biofuels, that's sustainable aviation fuel, and green hydrogen, and then water bottling facilities. We know that over 20 cities alone were approached in the last year and that the decisions last year moved very quickly, often under non-disclosure agreements without adequate environmental review. So we started getting questions from city administrators and residents, and they were confusing to us until we looked at a map like this, which is electric and fiber infrastructure in the country. Where their data centers are abundant in these areas where you see that circles kind of vague on this map, they're already exceeding the grid capacity. So the data center development is moving to parts of the country that have more electric production. And if you look at the grid, zoom in Minnesota, the data center requests that you might be familiar with, Becker, North Mankato, Lakeville, Farmington, Cannon Falls, Hampton, Pine City, Greater Rochester area, are aligned with these networks. Um, we see this as a tension because water is not being thought of in where these industries were looking, at least initially. And we do know that there is a need to balance economic development, but we have to also ensure the sustainable future of these communities. So there is a tension that is solvable if you take the time to examine the distribution of the natural environment. But the development process we saw this last year was with uh, tax incentives and our state economic development team incentivizing industries to come to Minnesota and then working with regional planners to site the industries. Then the cities were approached directly and asked for land, power, and maybe water. That this is typically when the non-disclosure agreements were being signed, and it took, if you followed what was happening, for example, in Hermantown, this is a year-long process where they're kind of negotiating with the company and discussing land use and power. These might not be the ultimate users of the data center technology. They might be developers who are creating these facilities that data centers might move into. So there might be gaps in what is actually known about the ultimate use. The agreement is often reached and the project then goes public. Um, this is this is what has happened last year again and again. And this process, as you see to this point, avoided any environmental review. It was at this point, however, the citizens and other people involved in environmental review typically learned about it and started asking the questions like, is this sustainable? Did you use the groundwater data we have? And so on. So possible adverse outcomes are that there could be potential private well interference with a large water user on the urban fringe. The rates for water and electricity might be impacted for the citizens in the region. There might be environmental impacts that weren't considered in this process, and the city could potentially be saddled with expensive infrastructure. So design critical information on water availability and other aspects of the environment was lacking in the way this proceeded last year. We do have some statutes that should protect us and significantly in the case of drought. We prioritize domestic water use in Minnesota. This is legal statute. Water supply, domestic water supply, and power producers who have contingency plans have the highest priority. And then we go on down the list, and it's really the fifth priority of use where data centers really belong, because they are large users and they are industrial large water users. So that by hooking up to municipal supply, they're actually kind of circumventing this statutory agreement. So the issues that we see that were last session or last year was that these projects were moving really fast, faster than planners could react, faster than policy could respond. Cities didn't have necessarily the tools they needed to evaluate the regional and long-term sustainability of these projects. The short-term incentives were there, however, and those were very attractive to some cities. They looked financially beneficial. Typically, there was no community engagement in these processes, and there were a lot of stakeholders ultimately that cared. And this made being proactive potentially a challenge, but I don't think it was really considered in any of these processes. So, what I'm going to tell you now is what I think as a geologist and as a freshwater researcher, the questions that should be asked. And I'll start with what the usable distribution of groundwater is. We are blessed in Minnesota with a glacier that covered everywhere, and parts of Minnesota, including your southeastern region, that have water available in the bedrock. I'm going to not talk about the glacial sediment aquifers because although you have glacial sediment, that's not what you use in southeast Minnesota for your aquifers. And just to show you the margin of the last ice lobe, this Des Moines lobe, is basically I-35. You're in this region that has the numbers 6 and 5. Glaciated, the truly unglaciated part of Wisconsin lies east of the Mississippi River and is part of this area. But if you kind of brush off or scrape off the up to 50 feet of windblown sediment and weathered glacial till, then you'll find this sequence of layered sedimentary rocks. They're pictured on the right in the column that you would typically see them in. You can probably go to a bluff on the Root River or the Whitewater or something and see some of these units sticking out. You'll see sandstone units. You'll see the ones that have bricks here that are limestone units. The yellow are the sandstone, and these are in the southeastern 20-some counties. The rest of Minnesota does not have these rocks. So you do have groundwater moving slowly through these layers, and then there's some other layers that kind of impede the flow of groundwater. This is a diagram of the two different kind of areas. I'm going to show you kind of this western area where this light blue is the first rock, and then this eastern area where the darker blue is the first rock. So where the light blue was the first rock. You have sinkholes developed on the surface. You do have some of these layers that impede the flow of water. Here's the Decorah Shale. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then a sandstone at depth. So this would be forming your river valleys or your bluffs. As you go farther east, you have a different layer at the surface, the Shakopee Formation. This is an aquifer, this is an aquifer, and so is a sandstone. So everything blue or yellow is an aquifer. This first scenario is important because these are places where you have some problematic groundwater movement at the Decorah edge. So if you think about what we typically consider southeastern Minnesota geology, we think about caves and sinkholes and springs, and they are not evenly distributed in the region. The green dots here are sinkholes, and you can see they're kind of falling in a zone, almost a northwest southeast zone, but there are some sinkholes farther east. This is at the Decorah edge, so you can see this pink zone is where there is a shale layer, an impermeable layer, and it's right kind of at the edge of that shale layer that you get the most sinkholes. And that's because of the way the shale impacts the way water moves underground. Um, these sinkholes are really interesting in and of themselves because they're just like buckets, holes, house-sized depressions in fields where streams can just drop into the ground. And then you don't really know exactly where that water emerges again. And here's some examples of where sinkholes are in these little diamonds. And then these arrows show that the springs that these two sinkholes feed are sometimes very close and sometimes quite far away. Sometimes they cross topographic divides. They don't just follow down the valley. So you have a complex underground system of water movement. And sometimes it takes, here we have a dye trace example where somebody put a tracer into one of these sinkholes to see when and where it would come out. And it comes out 28 to sometimes 70 days later. So it's water clearly taking different paths. And from what we know about the bedrock under your region, we know that it kind of gets down into these limestone units, might flow through the caves for some of it or along bedding planes in the limestone and eventually emerge. So I would say not only should you understand the distribution of usable groundwater, but also everything about this hydrogeologic system because it's complicated and you can unintentionally create some situations that could be problematic for development. So who's already using the groundwater and how much? We know where private wells are, and I didn't zoom in on these because this is everyone has a well log if their well has been drilled since the 70s, but I didn't want to share personal information necessarily. But you can click on the record and geologists actually use these records for reconstructing the geology, but a well owner might also use it to understand what aquifer they're using. So we track wells in private wells in Minnesota and high capacity users. The DNR does the high capacity well permitting, and they monitor groundwater use over time. And then the well index is maintained by the Minnesota Department of Health because it is a health issue to have clean drinking water. We do have a pretty good distribution of monitoring wells in Minnesota, but I think they're lacking a little bit in the southeastern part of the state. But these are typically just kind of, it's like a dipstick in the aquifer so that you know how much water is there and if it's changing over time. Um, so another question, how is the water replenished? Well, in Minnesota now it's coming in from rain. In the past, it has come in from glaciers sitting on our area and melting into the rock. And an aquifer is like a bank account. You have to think about the income and you have to think about how you might be changing the way water enters the ground. And if our past climate scenario is going to be similar to future recharge scenarios. We know from models of climate change that we are going to see changes in the distribution of precipitation, the seasonality of it, the intensity of rainfall events, and on the flip side, more hot days, which usually increases water use, especially in the summer for irrigation, irrigation. And lawn watering actually is one of the larger uses. I think you're no stranger to mega rain events in southeastern Minnesota. I pulled up a couple that were kind of historic in nature. The 1978 flash flood in southeastern Minnesota, and then the one more recently in 2007, where, this lavender color is getting up to 14 inches down in that area of Hoka. So these extreme rain events might represent the same average annual precipitation, but when you get 14 inches in 24 hours, it's not soaking into the ground effectively. It's running off and flooding the area instead of. So we're looking at larger events, longer duration dry spells, and maybe a slight increase in annual precipitation if you look at kind of the past decadal averages. So I think you can see these bar graphs are stepping up a bit. So are there other concerns with using high volumes of groundwater? Well, one of the concerns in southeastern Minnesota is the existence of high nitrate concentrations in the upper aquifers. So here we have this column of rock again, and these upper layers that are more fractured, closer to the surface, tend to have more of the agricultural runoff chemicals in them. And if you start drawing down the lower aquifers, a lot of times when people are impacted by high nitrates, they just drill a deeper well. If a deeper well is used by a high volume water user, they can actually change the gradient, the pressure gradient, and draw more of that contaminated water deeper into the ground. The flow system has been recently studied by a group, Kevin Keener, who's with the Department of Ag and is in southeast Minnesota. Actually, he's just over the Iowa border. People from the Geological Survey and DNR have tried to understand the ages of groundwater, how long it's underground. These numbers here are let's see, which are the ages? That's depth, the residence time in years. So we're getting up to about 50-year-old groundwater as you get down into these lower units, the St. Lawrence, Lone Rock, and Wanawak formations. And then more like 20-year-old groundwater up here. And it's this shallower system that is still seeing increasing nitrate levels. Um, I also want you to think in terms of residence time of groundwater because if you're using water, your bank account, if you're spending money faster than your income, then you're going to end up with a depleted system and water no longer supporting springs and trout streams like the Root River. So if you're using water, 50-year-old water, 100-year-old water, and it's not being recharged, then that's a concern, something to think about. This is a simpler diagram to show you that we tend to think of the younger water as being in these upper horizons. Sinkhole formation can be enhanced. So this is the category of are there other concerns about high volume water users? Sinkholes can be enhanced if they were once like water-filled caves, and then you pump the water out of it, and now you have an air-filled cave, and it's no longer supported by that water. You can create new sinkholes. And again, the Decorah Edge is where we see the bulk of the sinkholes. So water table lowering could potentially increase sinkholes. I want to show you that Rochester and Olmsted County have thought about the Decorah Edge. That's kind of represented by this steep slope right here. And it's this place where this is a shale here. The water's not soaking into the ground, but instead is flowing off and coming off to the right, off to the surface. This is where you get the springs in Rochester, and it's just problematic to build either right on top of the shale or right below it because you're going to have continuous groundwater flow. So these are the kind of geological nuances that make, the area east of Highway 52 not just a blank canvas, but actually a very nuanced landscape that needs to be considered carefully where things are sited. These conditions also lead to landslides and rockfall in the region, as do the steep slopes and the high precipitation events. Um, I want to show you how large some of these landslides are. We're in the South Branch of the Root River here, and I want you to just look at that for a second, see if you can find the landslides, because there's several. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, and there. And I'm going to zoom in on this one in this area. Oh, one more down there. So this is what we call the Forestville Store Slide. We don't know how old this is, but this whole part of the hillside has crumpled down. It's old enough that a road has been built across it with probably no knowledge that it was there. But it's this chaotic terrain right here. And these landslides can potentially be activated by high precipitation events. Sometimes they're fed by sinkholes, like that's a little sinkhole right there. Can you see my cursor, by the way? It's a little sinkhole. And so, if you get a high rain event, a lot of water going down through that tunnel, it can lubricate that slide material. The other thing that can happen here is if you have flooding on this river, or maybe a large groundwater discharge to this river through your wastewater treatment plant, you might erode the toe of this slide and create the potential for more movement. So where large water users discharge their water is also a concern in this region because of the geology, the sinkholes, the karst, and the landslides. Other concerns with increased pumping are that you can potentially migrate any existing contamination. I know that there are landfills in the Olmsted County area that have some low-level radioactive waste. I think it's from the hospitals. I don't know if that's what's pictured here, but there are certainly some known areas of contamination. You start to pump hard in one area, you can draw that water into that pumping well or migrate it. And then there are also some just natural things in the rocks that are harmful, like arsenic and manganese. Not so much a problem in southeast, but more in south central Minnesota. But we still think about arsenic and manganese as being potentially mobilized by large pumping events. And we see that happening right now in the Niagara Water Bottling Plant in Elko New Market. So when I think about the questions that should be asked is for large water users, we're really adding the water demands of a medium city when we think about these water users. It's not just a typical industrial use. And if you look at the Great Lakes region, I know as a geologist that water is not uniform across the region, and I know that the reason you get fewer large cities as you go west in Minnesota is in part because it's water limited out there. And you can certainly see that in Canada. It's water limited as you get up into the boundary waters types of rocks, into the Canadian Shield. So we have abundant surface water sources at the lakes and on our major rivers, and somewhat more limited groundwater sources. So I would caution anybody who wants to start a new medium-sized city to not look at the current urban fringe, because that's probably where we've already gotten beyond our surface water sources. That's what we use in Minneapolis, St. Paul as surface water, Mississippi River and lakes. Um, but as you get to the urban fringe, you're going to be encountering a lot of private well owners, and a large volume water user will potentially impact thousands of private wells. And as you get farther from the sources of the Great Lakes and major rivers, you're also going to be reliant completely on groundwater, and that doesn't support a medium-sized city, frankly. Areas with only glacial sediment aquifers, that's not your situation. Areas where there's seasonal water scarcity, where it might be irrigated or drought prone. I don't think that is southeast Minnesota. I don't see much irrigation down there, but I would say that the karst and spring region, and especially these springs that are feeding cold water features like your streams, your trout streams, that I would issue caution there. And then areas with these other geologic hazards like landslides or erosion prone slopes. Um, Other things that you might consider, this is maybe out there, but we now know globally that groundwater discharge is the leading contributor to sea level rise. It's exceeding the of water added by ice melt. So, other questions that should be asked, well, have you talked to your people? What are their priorities for water use, land use, energy use? And this is where if members of some hyper local organizations, they're often the first to see or reflect on what these impacts might be, but they're often not included in those first conversations, especially if the process is not transparent and an NDA has been signed. This will lead to further fear and distrust in government, and it can commonly perpetuate environmental injustices that are already there. If there's no clear government pathway for these groups, they might take varying routes. Like if they don't know what Catherine was describing about how to complete an EAW or an EIS, they might just go straight to the legal system. They might go straight to the media. Potentially they can navigate the formal environmental review process, or they might resort to public protest. Um, all of those things can waylay and stall a project to the frustration of a developer or a city even, and result in lawsuits. Of the city. So if you start with some inclusive bottom-up practices, there's less need to revise your plans later. We are in conversation with the city administrators, as you heard Andy talk about, not with Rochester here. These little dart boards, it looks like, are the wells for the city of Rochester. They have 42 wells, and they are up against kind of needing more. And then Byron, Stewartville, and Lewiston around them are looking at, adding high volume water users. Um, the electricity is on these cities administrators' mind, not water, but they did stop and ask, what don't we know? What should we be asking? Should we be planning regionally? So that's why we were involved in this process, year-long process that Andy talked about. Hope you came on the call early enough to hear that, because I'm going to skip through these slides, except to say that our planned outcome is we want research-backed information to be provided to these cities. We want them to understand what their community priorities are, give the city a proactive negotiating position with a developer, and support for regional economic development that secures their water and energy future. So alternatives to using groundwater, it's surface water is the more sustainable water source to use. Maybe not in Southeast. I don't think any of your rivers really would support a large water user. You don't have any lakes or artificial impoundments like mine pit lakes, so you probably don't have adequate surface water except on the Mississippi, I would say. Um, there might be reclaimed water sources that could be used. So if there's a large continuous supply of wastewater or dewatering from quarries or structures or discharge from other industries. That's a possibility. I will say that the path to reuse water in Minnesota is not very clear. We have a lot of state agencies that regulate different aspects of water use. And this is an example taken from a hypothetical ball field that wants to flush its toilets with rainwater. If the rainwater falls on the roof of the facility of the dugout, then it becomes something the MPCA looks at, the Pollution Control Agency, because stormwater can have contaminants in it. And then if it is held in a pond alongside the ball field, then the DNR might get involved because it's a water of the state if it's held in a pond in the ground. And MPCA manages stormwater too. If it's used to irrigate the ball field, the DNR is involved because that's a permitted use of a water of the state, and then the Department of Health might get involved because irrigation water, if it's not treated, can potentially have human contaminant or pathogens in it, something like Legionella. And then if it's used to flush the toilets, the Department of Labor and Industry gets involved because it requires specific plumbing code. So that's complicated. If you're a business rushing to market, you're not going to try to figure out what this pathway is for water reuse. You're going to probably do the quickest, easiest, cheapest thing. Um, I'm putting this in here for Regini because she's the city manager of Lewiston. I'm sorry, you're Stewartville. Lewiston.
Lewis.
Um, Lewiston, yeah. And I'm very sorry to hear about that shooting. But Regini brought up the Lefdal mine in Norway. It's a green option for data center development. This is the mine on the left. It's a very large, I think it's molybdenum mine that's mined out. And they put data centers down in the chambers of the mine where it's cooler, water's dripping in. They're using just the natural environment to not only make the data centers cool, but also secure. So, maybe in the caves in southeastern Minnesota, I don't know if there's an engineering firm in the region up to that challenge, but it's something that Regini brought to our attention as, she would love to explore or have the time to explore. But I'm going to say what I think the steps should be in kind of a more uh, a better paced process would be that the state agencies are able to make groundwater data available to guide business to areas with sustainable water, and that planners engage across their political jurisdictions and use shared tools to guide regional development. Cities consult their stakeholders, frontline communities, find out what the trade-offs are, prioritize choices. State require and incentivize the circular design for water and heat, using the waste heat. I saw that question pop up in the chat because these are opportunities, not things to just discard. Um, and then the Attorney General could ensure even enforcement of existing laws, address agency fear of lawsuits if they don't proceed with certain regulatory processes or speed permit review, and attend to the environmental injustices for communities that lack resources and can't necessarily muster the people power to fill out an EIS. But I want to spend 1 second more on this planning tool because you have a planning tool. You in this region have the Root River One Watershed One Plan designed across political jurisdictions, all these counties, to think about these things. These were what Root River identified as their scientific and technical emerging issues 10 years ago when they created the plan. And water movement within a karst landscape is one of these. This is a great example of how this one watershed, one plan could bring these communities to the same room to think about this. And I noticed that it's a 10-year-old plan, so you already are renewing it. I think you were the first one watershed, one plan in the state. The comment period's closed, but maybe we can reopen that and tweak it a little bit so that we think more specifically about large volume water users in these watersheds in southeastern Minnesota. And I'll say one other tool that is coming, maybe not fast enough for you, is that last week I was funded to create a water risk atlas to align economic pace of development with water security. And this is in partnership with Shared Geo and the Water World Resources Institute. We're going to start as soon as the governor signs the bill. So hopefully January. Thank you for inviting Freshwater.